No, since we last met, I've also gone deeper into more Indian and Indic work. And I think what I'm left wondering is how much of the work coming from the West. One is I'm realizing how much the colonization has also affected us as taking on some of the Western models, and a
Yeah,
lot of unlearning happened for me.
yeah,
So learning the dialogue space, uh, equally trying to see whether it is even applicable or relevant in India, because I just feel the whole Indian cosmology, if I can say that, has a different set of assumptions about a lot of things itself, about
yeah,
life, about interconnectedness, and it goes very deep. The cultural roots of that go very deep.
absolutely.
Um,
That's really interesting.
so
Yeah, yeah, that's a
yeah,
very interesting question right there. I mean, that's a big question and a really interesting
yeah,
one.
yeah. And I was trying to look for. I was trying to build the idea of the center as both an inner space from where you can be, and also as a socio-political movement, an ideology or an approach. I would not say an ideology, but an approach of engaging in the socio-political space. And when I was trying to articulate that centrist ideology or way of being, I realized that across many generations in India, already something like that has been pointed at. And what started as a socio-political exploration reached a very spiritual domain, that individuals need to be connected to their center before creating something which could be a movement.
Mm.
And the center is all that. It's like that the Tao that can be named is not the Tao, and you have Kabir and you have Buddha and you have all kinds of songs and everything pointing to a space like a dynamic center, right? Like something where you're fully present and not operating from an ideology or from a pre-thought thing. So
Absolutely.
there is something there which needs to be articulated in fresh language, though, because while the spirit is ancient, it needs new language and expression for today's times,
Mm.
which can ring with people. So
Mm.
I realized that rather than articulating a new ideology or a new path,
Mm.
perhaps what you need to do is a new articulation of an ancient path.
That's,
And there is a cultural memory of that, I feel, which can get evoked.
yeah, I
Uh,
think that's the really interesting part because in a certain, I mean, that in a way is we don't have that, right? We
hmm,
don't have that connection. So in a certain way, I think that's a very important work that could happen in India because there is that, as you said, as you put it, there's that memory of that
yeah,
connection
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that's inherent. I mean, it's inbuilt. It's just
yeah,
in
yeah.
there. In some ways, it's very a lot of the sort of reinterpretations of say um, let's say sort of new thinking. Well, new thinking well, the kind of new thinking in the West anyway. Most of it tends to be very secular, because we don't really we've become so disconnected from something other, and we're very, there's a lot of kind of difficulty with dealing with sort of the whole concept of spirituality in any way.
Hmm.
So that's a real problem here. I mean, it is. Um, so and a lot of the new thinking misses that. It misses that deeper, um, that kind of that deeper dimension. It just does. I mean, the
Yeah.
ideas are all great and everything, and the articulation of ideas is there's some fantastic articulation of new kind of
Hmm,
thinking.
hmm, hmm.
When I say new thinking, it's not just a new thinking that say was happening about 10 years ago. Which was more sort of very intellectual. I mean, it is a new thinking that actually is attempting to 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 be a lot more holistic,
Hmm.
and as a response to sort of the growing recognition of response to the kind of meta crisis that we're in, right? So in
Hmm.
one way, that is that has really developed a lot, but there's still this deeper spiritual dimension,
Yeah.
which is sort of like, which is so embedded in a culture like India's, still there,
Yeah, yeah,
is so disappeared here that it's much harder for people to really, connect to that. In my
yeah.
experience.
Think one impact of that is also not fully embracing the limits of the cognitive mind, because when I look at
Exactly.
what's coming out of the West, it's dense, it's intellectual, and it tries to make better and better maps of reality, not realizing that map making itself can become its own limitation, and that there are other ways of knowing beyond detailed, conceptual, more and more complex models. So I
Exactly.
think,
I mean, funnily enough, that
yeah.
was the thing. I don't know if you read that thing I wrote about Daniel Schmackenberger, but that was my sort of,
Yeah, yeah, I read it. I read it. I read your article on Daniel Smattenberger.
yeah. So
Yeah, yeah,
that
I
was
did.
my kind of journey with him, because when I first encountered him, I thought he was like, this guy's like brilliant, which he is.
Hmm.
No question
Hmm.
about that.
Yeah, yeah,
But I also felt like, you know, he's so kind of into the philosophy of science, and I just felt like, I don't know, there's something missing here. But actually, interestingly, he is actually somebody who I would say actually does have another dimension, which is, but
hmm.
he's one of the few people, one of the few that really does actually. And I
Hmm.
only discovered that through really going more into his work, and so that was an interesting process. But um, I think he does, to an extent, at least to an extent. But I totally agree
Yeah,
with you about the sort of, I mean, the championing of the sort of whole cognitive framework is just something that we're so embedded in the West. It's still, we still are, because we just don't have, we've eradicated other ways of experiencing the world, you know to such an extent.
yeah. I mean, I also find myself out of depth to engage in too much dialogue, because I see a certain conceptual rigor and a certain very, very clear, sharp kind of theoretical underpinning. And I personally, at least, it's like, how do I say? In a very simple way, it's like in the West, when history gets documented, it's like this happened in 1847 or whatever. But in India, it's like itihas, like it's happened somewhere, sometime, and it's spoken not in. It's almost like the language. One is that we get limited by language, because Hindi and Sanskrit have terms which do not necessarily have exact English replicas. So that is kind of first, you get
Right.
stuck at language, grammar, and literally the syntax itself, and the fact that in Hindi and Sanskrit words have multiple meanings simultaneously. So it's almost like the amount of meaning you're loading on language is way higher or different.
Mm.
That is one. And yeah, like I said, it's been hard to plug that. Like I find it very hard for Indian thinkers. There is hardly any engagement, right? Like there is no Indian thinking engaging with the Western thinking at the moment, because of a combination of reasons. And I don't know where that dialogue will ever happen, if it will ever happen, and how will that dialogue happen, because it's going to be hard to figure out on in which worldview to locate it,
Yes.
because
Right.
and this again like comes back to the fact that I feel like in India the ancient babas and seekers and all those people would never be front facing public personalities, right? The word would just get around
Mm.
that, oh, there is someone like that, and there would
Right.
never be like a big brand publicity going on. They were
Right.
very humble, very small. Now we know about them because the word got around. So it's almost like this whole kind of American or Western way of public branding and
Yeah.
going out there and all.
Yeah.
So I find a lot of Indian thinkers very reclusive, and almost you could look at them and say they're underconfident given the depth that they have,
Right.
like
Right.
solid depth, solid, and yeah, there is something there which needs healing, needs some dialoguing. There's also that pain of some of our ideas, quote unquote, our ideas being repackaged. I mean, they belong to all of humanity, so you can't say it's Indian ideas.
Mm.
But it's not like there is attribution or anything that, oh, this idea came or its origins are traced back here somewhere.
Mm.
So there is also that pain in Indian thinkers, I would say, that
Yeah.
there's been ideas have been stolen. So all that I'm seeing now.
I can totally understand that, and I actually know. quite a number of people in India who definitely feel the pain of that very much.
Yeah.
Um, so, Abby, what do you feel? I mean, it's really interesting what you're saying. Really interesting. What do you feel could be? I mean, how are you kind of moving forward with what you're describing yourself? I mean, in terms of within India and or with it. I mean, how are there sort of people or groups or how do you see moving forward with some of these questions within India? I mean, because they're really important questions, I think, and really
Yeah.
really significant.
I think one question I'm holding is what is the right relationship with the past?
Right.
Because that has troubled India a lot. And it's interesting that the contemporary India hates the Muslims for invading in the 11th and 12th centuries, but somehow is so colonized that the British colonized part is almost invisible. Like it's never brought out in the same light, though it
Really?
was. Yeah, I feel that this, especially this Hindutva
Oh, because of
wave,
because of
yeah,
Hindutva, yeah. Oh, I
is
see.
really zoned in there. But
Wow.
I think the deeper question, really, Steve, is what is the right relationship with the past, and
Mm,
how long should you hold on to the past, and what now kind of a thing, right? Like my own felt sense of it is that uh, too much of a heavy relationship with the past is not healthy. Like you and I are able to meet in a space where we are human beings and not Indian and British, and we're able to put aside
mm,
our cultural baggage.
mm,
So there is something there.
yeah.
And at the same time, there's something in the fact that we have to acknowledge what has happened. And I think so. One question vis-a-vis, I would say, friends from the UK and is really around what is the right relationship with the past,
Mm,
and is it, how does one move on, because India definitely needs to move on from its past and say,
mm.
okay, past is past, let's now come back, and so it needs to
Well,
heal.
it's fascinating in a way, isn't it? Because it's like, on one hand, it's sort of like moving on from the past, and yet at the same time, uh, not the past is in a very positive sense sort of an integral part of who we are.
Oh
So
yes,
so
yes,
so,
yes,
but it's kind of
absolutely.
like it's kind of because the richness of the past is not something obviously that I mean, because you could argue, well, many of the sort of young tech folks in India have done exactly that, moved on from the past. Um, so obviously
Lost
that's
their
not the kind of
roots. Yeah.
moving on from the past that we're talking about.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
so it's
Which is why I'm framing it as what is the right relationship with the
right,
past.
right.
Not how does one move on
Oh,
from the
yeah,
past, but
yeah.
how do
No, I
you
think
relate
that's
to the
that's
past.
great.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
That's one. The other I feel is India and maybe the world needs a centrist movement. I feel like a movement which is not polarized, which is grounded in dialogue, and which, even if it doesn't become a mainstream political movement, can still be a movement that holds the consciousness at a certain level.
Mm,
So I'm energetically, can there be an energetic collective of people who themselves are committed to inner outer transformation and who can energetically hold space for change?
mm,
And one of the things I just recently started, I'm calling the fellowship. And it's for people who are lifelong committed to inner outer change and committed to walking together. So those are the two kind of conditions for the invitation, I guess. And I felt like the need to be with people who are committing their next 30, 40 years to walking together and saying that let's do this. Change takes time, it's a long journey, and we don't know what, so we'll walk into the uncertainty, but we're willing to walk together.
mm, mm,
And that just started, I started it like about 12, 13 days ago. I've been doing podcasts, we've been trying to tune into each other and see, uh, but I feel on a larger thing, a movement of a more intentional movement is there already. I mean, there is a movement already, it's just not as connected. uh, it's in so many pockets. So how does one energetically trusting resonance rather than conceptual ideas? No, like if like you and I have resonance, if there is resonance, then it hardly matters what conceptually is the content of what you're doing or what I'm doing, because we can trust resonance.
right,
So I feel
right.
resonance as a way of organizing around uh,
It's nice. I like that.
Yeah, so if we can cut
But
out all the intellectual words, I think words become vehicles for, you know,
yeah,
dividing us, and resonance and energetic resonance is a way of uniting us.
that's really good. I really like that. That's great. I mean, do you in India? Do you feel that there's a um, how does conceptually things get in the way in India? Would you say? I mean, generally, I mean, what are the issues that tend to get in the way conceptually, like in the way that you just said?
Conceptually, I don't know, but I know there is guilt and there is shame and there is envy in the cultural shadow. Envy of the West for sure, because West has materially succeeded way more, and so there is
Right,
envy and copying of that. There
right,
is shame about how we fell to a colonial power, and therefore shame that we were not strong enough to defend ourselves in spite of being such a large country.
mm,
To both the invasions
yeah,
starting the 11th, 12th century and then the colonization. So there is shame, uh, and there is some kind of guilt of letting our ancestors down, in the sense that there was a glorious period in India long, long ago, but
mm,
there was a peak period which we weren't able to live up to that,
mm, mm,
and kind of there was a fall. So the cultural shadow has a lot of this, that I would say one. um, and people are fragmented, Steve. I feel like when you're given a foreign education not in your mother tongue, and you're not adept at that, and you're given ideas that are intuitively not native. I guess non-native ideas get fed. So there's a native embodied reality, and then there is a non-native thing. So it's like half individuated. Like there is individuation happening, but there is also, so there is a lot of churning that's happening in India for sure. And yeah,
yeah. Abby, I mean, that's, I think that's incredibly well described, what you just described. And that sounds so right to me, what you're saying. I mean, have you found that there are spaces in which that you feel is being successfully um, kind of explored and kind of there's sort of some movement forward in relationship to all of that? I mean, do you feel there are spaces in which that is
yeah,
happening?
yeah, definitely. Very small spaces, but I know a couple of them. For example, some retreat centers, some collectives. It's definitely happening,
Mm,
and digging into Indic roots, and also I would say Deer Park in Beer near
yeah,
Dharamshala is doing that.
right,
Ritambara Ashram in Kotagiri would be doing that. Um, in Blue Ribbon, we are trying to do some of that
right,
with
right,
whatever has come up.
right.
So there are several places. Shikshantar in Udaipur is trying to do that
Mhm,
as well. So
mhm, mhm.
places where that conversation is alive, and
Right,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
right. I mean, that in itself is terrific.
yeah.
I mean, so that's really good. So what you were describing in terms of this new initiative that you're exploring, how does that fit with what's already existing? How do you see that?
So there are about, I feel there are between 5 to 10,000 young people in India who have been through at least some social change experience. They've been through a 2 year fellowship like Teach for India or Community Connect fellowship and so on. So they have contributed some clear time to the social space. And they're all in their early 20s, mid 20s, which means if we could build a collective where they are groomed, not only groomed for leadership, but help in terms of how do they figure out their livelihoods, their relationship with their parents, finding love in their lives, and if they're holistically groomed over a period of 15 odd years.
Mm,
This is my current thinking. It's a lot of abstraction, but I still want to, like, in my heart, I'm saying that if we're able to collectively groom them on scale, on some scale, then that can become a collective that can energetically hold the birthing of something new in the country.
mm, mm,
Um, and if they're aligned, if they're committed to working together, then we have something going right there.
mm,
So maybe I'm doing fellowship. So I guess my organizing, Steve, has moved from a lot of conceptual planning and models to genuine emergence, like really
right,
doing my brain, putting
right,
my brain strictly back in place and saying, okay, I don't know. and there is no vision, we'll figure it out, and like just complete surrender to nature and nature's forces.
Right. That
I
sounds great.
figured that, yeah, if something new has to be born, I have to get myself out of the way. And I think to quite an extent I'm being able to do that, to just trust what is resonating, what is emerging.
Mm,
But the intent is that the intent is if we can build a collective in India that is aligned to the ideas of pluralism, dialogue,
mm,
and to the center, right? People finding their own center,
mm.
not and center close
Yes,
to what, say,
that's very important actually.
yeah.
That's a really big deal what you're saying about finding your own center, because what you were describing about the kind of issues, emotional issues, issues to do with the past that are unresolved
Hmm, hmm.
is all part of actually finding one center. I mean, it's all integral part of
Yeah,
finding
yeah,
one center,
yeah,
and that's a critical work. Actually, it's
yeah,
really
yeah,
critical work, because otherwise, it's very hard to embrace anything other than those issues. Really, you can't really move on.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's really important work. Actually,
yeah. I'm kind of leaning a bit on Krishnamurti there, trying to at least to say that each person be a light unto themselves, and that we don't get married to an ideology or try to organize the truth,
right,
but really respond from the truth of the moment,
right,
uh,
right.
and do that not as an impulsive response but as a very intentional response.
Yes,
So, how do we cultivate that capacity in people? I think
mm.
that is the challenge.
Yes. But
Yeah, that's
but I think it's fantastic. It's really, really
yeah.
excellent what you're talking about. Um, I mean, in a sense, it's very sort of what you're describing is very sort of existential kind of work. I mean, it's like it's not, because you're what you're describing is not something sort of around some particular issue, or you know um, some sort of aspect of all this. It's very, very core what you're describing. It's kind of, and I think it's a kind of core development process that's really important. And I think, the other thing is that strikes me about that is that, I was very struck when I was in India last, that I was really reflecting on the fact that, you know, what's the place for, interaction between, say, different cultures and things? Because on one hand, I feel like, that's actually really is important in some way. I don't even know quite how to describe why, but I just think it is. And at the same time, like every culture, like same with us. I mean, part of the reason why even though we feel like India is in many ways our real home, we're here because we're from here, and there's work that we need to really do here because we are from here, and so that's a very real thing. And on the and also, like being in India, I'm very aware that India and Indians have got their own. They've got shared collective things that need to be really explored, and within your culture, and that's just a very, very important work, just like it is over here. So those things are really important. And at the same time, I'm also obviously thinking, well, what does it mean for us, say Mary and I, to move forward within India in terms of, you know, something that is shared, between
Yeah, yeah,
cross cultures, like,
yeah. I'll share a heuristic or like a thumb rule that came to me recently, which is like one third, one third, one third. Like I feel like one third of our work is with Indians and in Indian culture, just as one third of your work is probably with British and British
yeah,
culture.
yeah,
And another one third is the work of dialogue across cultures,
right,
which
right,
is the kind of domain of your question, I'm guessing. And I feel a third one third is a humanity level conversation that's beyond culture. That's where
uh,
climate change or meta
uh,
crisis and us being in the grip, it's not culturally dependent. And I feel
right.
like we need to play all these three kind of
Yeah,
bucket.
that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah,
Yeah, but to answer your question, I definitely think India and UK have a lot of work to do vis-a-vis each other, right? And governments are not going to do it, so people need to do it. And that work has to be of a collective healing space, because I feel both the oppressor and the oppressed, if you use that framework, are linked together by karma, by destiny, and that healing can't be only of the oppressor or the oppressed.
I mean
It's a collective
that would be an
process.
awesome thing to to, you know, to meet on.
Yeah, yeah. So I see it as a combination of dialogue, processes, sharing mutually, and yeah, some even some physical embodied work and rituals. Even who knows,
Yeah,
between a selected group of people who are from these two countries, doing it on behalf of their ancestors. No, I think something like that.
exactly, exactly,
That
exactly
would
right.
be worth exploring. I would definitely be interested in exploring something like that. I definitely feel called to the. I feel equipped also, not only called to do some of this work.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
fabulous. That sounds so good. That sounds very, very good. I mean, these are things I think about all the time because I sort of, like both Mary and I, we have these kind of two lives. We, you know, two sort of centers of our life. One is here and one is in India. Really, that's kind
right.
of, and they're both, you know, very important. And so these questions are things I'm thinking about all the time. Really.